Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable world of ancient Rome, a civilization that had the free time and confidence to test every substance on Earth to see what would happen. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When most people think of ancient Rome, they picture marble statues, stern senators, and philosophers walking around looking deeply disappointed in everyone. What they don't picture is an empire where half the citizens were wandering around the streets, slightly buzzed, moderately euphoric, or spiritually convinced they just received a private message from Jupiter himself. But that's the version of Rome we're talking about tonight. The Rome that your history teacher absolutely chose violence by ignoring. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. You might imagine the Roman Empire as a place filled with gladiators, battles, and marble monuments. Yet for most Romans, the people who lived beneath the grand narratives, the empire smelled mostly of soil, plants, and burning herbs. And in those overlooked gardens, tucked behind ordinary homes, something unexpectedly common took place. Quiet moments of altered consciousness, not from grand ceremonies or wild festivals, but from the humble, boring routines of daily life. To understand how this happened, you must first picture the Roman garden, not the large estates of senators, which you might expect, but the hortus, the home garden of a regular citizen. These patches of land were typically small, squeezed behind modest houses, bounded by low walls, and organized with a surprising degree of intention. Romans treated these spaces as miniature laboratories, places to grow vegetables, treat illnesses, prepare offerings, and experiment with dozens of herbs whose properties they only partially understood. The Roman poet Virgil once wrote about gardens with an admiration bordering on reverence, noting how they offered a quiet refuge from the bustle of the city. But for most Romans, gardens were less about poetry and more about subsistence. They grew whatever they needed for cooking or medicine. Lettuce, leeks, garlic, onions, and artichokes commonly lined the garden beds. But in the shaded corners, protected from too much sun, you would find the more potent plants, those that carried aromas or effects that Romans found either comforting, medicinal, or faintly intoxicating. One of the most important of these plants was silphium, though by the early imperial period it had already become rare. Silphium was not a hallucinogen, but it was used so widely and in such varied ways: seasoning, perfume, incense, medicine, that its presence influenced countless daily rituals. The plant's scarcity only increased its mystique. Even its smell was said to be soothing in a way that quieted the mind. But silphium was not the Romans' only source of such effects. You might be surprised to learn that Roman incense, something we often associate with temples and solemnity, contained ingredients capable of producing calm, dizziness, or trance-like states when burned in enclosed spaces. Frankincense, myrrh, storax, cinnamon, and juniper berries were commonly used. When combined with the resins of pine and cypress, they produced a heavy, lingering aroma. In poorly ventilated rooms, these scents built up in the air, creating sensations that Romans interpreted as divinely inspired calm. Most Romans were not seeking intoxication. Instead, they used these substances to relax, purify, or treat ailments. But the effects were real. The writer Pliny the Elder recorded numerous accounts of herbs and resins that altered the mind, some subtly and others more dramatically. He wrote that certain incense mixtures caused the head to lighten, while others produced excessive serenity. One particularly common herb was henbane, or Hyacinthus niger. Romans did not typically consume it directly, but they burned it. The smoke had a distinct effect, a numbing calm, sometimes accompanied by a mild sense of separation from one's surroundings. Henbane was dangerous in large quantities, but in the small doses created from leaves mixed into incense bundles, it softened the mind without causing hallucinations. You can imagine a Roman family at dusk, the household gathered in a small atrium. A bundle of dried herbs smolders on a terracotta dish. The faint smoke curls upward, mixing with the shadows cast by flickering lamplight. People move slowly. Conversations quiet. No one thinks of this as altered consciousness. It is simply the end of a long day. But these gardens were not merely homes for herbs. They also reflected a particular Roman belief that the natural world was filled with invisible forces. Plants were not passive. Each herb had a spirit, a temperament, and an ideal usage. A Roman gardener would think carefully about where to plant oregano, because it was believed to prefer bright sun and dry soil. Mint, on the other hand, grew best near household drains where moisture collected. Every plant had its place, and tending it required patience and observation. This slow, daily rhythm shaped the Roman relationship with altered states. People did not get high intentionally. Instead, they drifted into gentle shifts in awareness through their ordinary routines, tending herb beds, preparing remedies, or burning incense for household gods. The effects were subtle but constant, influencing moods in ways Romans never had reason to question. Consider the example of the Roman kitchen. Many herbs used for cooking also carried mild sedative properties. Poppy seeds, for instance, were common in Roman bread. Not enough to cause dreams or visions, but enough to relax the nervous system. The same was true for rue, ruta, which Romans used both as a seasoning and a medicinal herb. Even basil, introduced from the East, was believed to clear the mind while calming the body. Ancient Roman physicians wrote extensively about these plants. The famous Dr. Galen classified them in terms of temperament: hot, cold, wet, or dry. These categories did not refer to temperature or texture, but to their perceived energetic qualities. An herb that was cold and dry might slow the body or steady the breath. An herb that was hot and wet might invigorate or sharpen the senses. Yet Romans rarely used herbs in isolation. They combined them, burned them together, or steeped them into oils. One of the most important practices was the preparation of unguenta, scented ointments. These mixtures often included olive oil infused with herbs like lavender, rosemary, or bay leaf. Some unguenta were purely practical, used for massage, healing, or cleaning, but others were used during religious rites. The combination of warming oil, the scent of herbs, and rhythmic movements created states of relaxation that might feel familiar to you today. And then there were the ritual fumigations, which involved burning herbs in small ceramic censers. These rituals had both domestic and spiritual purposes. For example, after illness swept through a household, Romans burned herbs believed to purify the air. But the smoke often included ingredients that induced a mild sense of detachment. It made the rituals feel more solemn, more otherworldly. A good example is laurel, the sacred plant of Apollo. Romans burned laurel leaves during celebrations or to cleanse homes after misfortune. When burned in quantity, laurel produces a fragrant smoke that fills a room with a warm, earthy scent. Though not intoxicating, it has a subtle calming effect that ancient writers associated with divine presence. The Roman world, then, was filled with plant-based experiences that softened the edges of awareness. Not dramatic, not visionary, but persistent and meaningful. You can imagine, perhaps, a quiet Roman afternoon in a garden. The sun is warm. The smell of crushed herbs lingers in the air. The garden beds are neat, simple, efficient. A gardener moves slowly among them, pruning here, watering there. The rhythms of the work create a kind of meditation. This is the heart of the story. The gentle, unintentional ways Romans shifted their minds, not through wild revelry, but through the slow, everyday intimacy they had with plants. Yet one question lingers. If these substances had such subtle but real effects on Roman life, if the smoke, scents, and herbs shaped moods and perceptions, how did Romans themselves interpret these sensations? Did they ever suspect that the divine calm they attributed to their gods might have originated from their own gardens? And so, as dusk settles over a small Roman home and the incense burns gently in its dish, you might wonder, did the Romans truly believe the gods were speaking to them through these scents? Or were they simply experiencing the quiet power of their own plants in ways they never fully understood? To understand why the Romans relied so deeply on their plants, and why the subtle effects of herbs and incense became woven into the fabric of their lives, you need to look more closely at the quiet science behind Roman herb culture. It was not a science in the way you know it today. Instead, it was a careful, slow collection of observations, passed down through households, families, and guilds, refined generation after generation by people who often had no idea they were practicing something akin to pharmacology. The Roman Empire, especially at its peak in the 2nd century CE, stretched across climates and landscapes that varied dramatically from one region to another. The herbs that grew naturally in the damp hills of Britain were entirely different from those found in the rocky terrain of Syria, the fertile valleys of Egypt, or the dry plains of Spain. As Roman influence expanded, so did its herbarium, the collection of plants Romans learned to use, cultivate, or trade. And because incense and oils traveled easily, their influence spread even faster than the plants themselves. This meant that an ordinary Roman household could contain plants whose origins lay hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, frankincense from Arabia, saffron from Persia, myrrh from Somalia, and resin from the Levant all made their way into Roman kitchens, shrines, and bathhouses. Each carried an aroma or effect that Romans learned to appreciate long before they understood the mechanisms behind them. But for most Romans, the true source of knowledge was experience. The head of a household, usually the paterfamilias, passed down practical instructions: how to dry thyme, when to harvest mint, which herbs to burn after childbirth, and how to grind poppy seeds without losing too much flavor. These instructions were not framed as science. They were framed as tradition. But as traditions accumulated, they formed a vast, informal catalog of the natural world. One of the most interesting aspects of Roman herb culture is how it blurred the line between medicine and mood. Herbs were categorized as remedies, even if their effects went beyond physical healing. A good example is valerian, a plant known today for its sedative properties. Romans used valerian root to soothe headaches, calm the nerves, and help with insomnia. They steeped the root in wine or ground it into salves. Though they did not know the active compounds, they understood its effects well. A Roman suffering from anxiety, not that they had a word for it, might sit quietly with a cup of valerian-infused wine, feeling their breath deepen and their thoughts slow. Even more common was fennel, a plant used widely for digestion. Yet when chewed raw, fennel seeds produced a sharp but warming sensation that cleared the mind. Pliny wrote that fennel brightens the eyes, which scholars today believe references both its visual clarity and its mild stimulatory effects. But among all the herbs Romans used, few intrigued them as much as opium poppy, known as Papaver somniferum. Though the Romans associated poppies with sleep, dreams, and the goddess Ceres, they also understood that the sap from the plant could induce powerful changes in awareness. Physicians used it sparingly, especially for severe pain, but households often grew smaller poppy varieties for cooking. The poppy seeds baked into bread or sprinkled over cheese did not contain opium, but the plant itself symbolized the delicate balance between mind, body, and spirit. The Romans' curiosity about these subtle effects created a culture where people constantly interacted with plants that influenced their states of mind, gently, almost imperceptibly, but consistently. And nowhere was this more evident than in the Roman baths. The bathhouses, thermae, were some of the most important social institutions in Rome. Every day, thousands of Romans visited public baths to wash, relax, and socialize. But the baths were not merely hot pools and marble rooms. They were also places filled with scent. The air was thick with the aromas of oils, herbs, and steam. Attendants massaged visitors with warmed olive oil infused with rosemary or bay leaf. Steam rooms were filled with eucalyptus-like herbs that opened the lungs. The combination of heat, scent, and slow breathing created sensations that modern visitors might compare to a mild, natural euphoria. This is where you begin to see how deeply the Romans intertwined body, plant, and environment. A Roman entering a bathhouse after a long day might first step into the apodyterium, the changing room, where shelves of oils released traces of their herbal scents. From there, they might move into the warm room, inhaling steam infused with botanical mixtures. Then to the hot room, where the heat expanded the effects of aromatic herbs. Finally, they would step into the cold pool, their senses sharpened, their mind floating somewhere between calm and alert. These experiences were not accidental. Romans understood that heat intensified aroma, and aroma softened the mind. This is why incense played such an important role in Roman religious life. They believed that the rising smoke carried prayers to the gods, but they also believed that the scents themselves prepared the mind to approach the divine. Burning incense created a sense of sacred quiet, even when used in small household rituals. The most common incense in domestic life was olibanum or frankincense. The resin burned slowly, releasing a sweet, citrus-like scent. Romans used it during offerings to household gods, the Laras and Penates, whose small shrines stood near the kitchen or atrium. But in closed rooms, frankincense could create a soft haze that blurred edges and eased breathing, allowing thoughts to stretch out in languid, drifting patterns. This drifting quality of Roman life becomes even clearer when you look at their festivals. Take, for example, the Lemuria, a ritual meant to appease restless spirits. At midnight, the head of the household would rise, walk barefoot through the home, and throw black beans over his shoulder while reciting an incantation. Meanwhile, incense burned in each room, filling the home with a dense, meditative haze. The participants believed they were engaging with unseen spirits, but in reality, they were entering a sensory environment carefully crafted to heighten solemnity and create calm. It is easy to view these rituals as superstitious, but they were rooted in the Romans' lived experience. They associated certain scents with certain states of mind because these associations had been reinforced over generations. Burn lavender, feel calm. Burn laurel, feel protected. Burn myrrh, feel solemn. Over time, these sensations formed an invisible language, a way for Romans to communicate moods, intentions, and emotions without speaking. You can imagine a Roman matron preparing her home for a small religious rite. She lights a clay censer filled with rosemary and juniper. As the scent fills the room, the air grows heavy and the atmosphere changes. She does not need to speak for her family to understand that a quiet, reflective mood is expected. The herbs have set it for her. This brings us to an important point. Romans did not separate the emotional from the physical, nor the spiritual from the sensory. To them, herbs did not merely influence the body, they influenced the entire person. One of the clearest examples of this is the Roman practice of fumigation for childbirth. After a birth, Romans burned specific herbs believed to seal the home against harmful spirits. Modern scholars think these herbs may have served as mild disinfectants or calming agents. Lavender, chamomile, and sage were commonly used, each producing scents that eased tension and created a sense of safety. While the ritual was framed as spiritual protection, the practical result was a household filled with soothing aromatics at a moment when calm was most needed. Another example is the Roman sick room. When someone fell ill, family members burned herbs meant to clear the air. But because many of these herbs, thyme, oregano, rosemary, have mild therapeutic effects, the room would fill with calming, antibacterial aromas. Even without medical knowledge, Romans created an environment that promoted rest. The smoke dimmed the light, softened the edges of the room, and created a sense of enclosure, isolating the sick from daily noise. These practices were not unique to Rome, but the Romans integrated them into daily life with remarkable consistency. Every morning, someone tended the house garden, inspecting plants for signs of stress. Every evening, someone lit a lamp or incense bundle. Every ritual, meal, and gathering involved scents, from the pungency of garlic to the sweetness of honey cakes infused with herbs. So when you consider the idea that Romans got higher than you'd believe, you must reinterpret what higher meant to them. It was not intoxication in the modern sense. It was a gentle, slow, cumulative shift in awareness created by constant exposure to aromatic herbs, daily incense use, infused oils, bathhouse environments, cooking practices, household rituals. The Romans lived in a world where scents and herbs were always present, shaping their moods in ways they rarely questioned. And yet, you might wonder, did Romans ever suspect that some of their most sacred experiences were shaped not by divine intervention, but by natural substances? Ancient authors occasionally hinted at this possibility. The philosopher Lucretius, in his poem De Rerum Natura, wrote that the effects of incense could mislead the mind into believing in divine presence. But his was a rare voice. Most Romans never separated the effects from the meaning. This interplay between nature and belief created a quiet but profound feature of Roman life, a sensory environment that gently nudged people toward calm, reflection, and ritual thinking, without them ever naming the sensation. The question that lingers is whether they understood the power of these plants as deeply as we think. Were they aware that the incense burning during temple sacrifices softened their minds, making them more receptive to religious awe? Did they sense that the bathhouse oils relaxed their thoughts as much as their muscles? Or did they simply accept these shifts as part of the world, never pausing to ask why certain scents made them feel closer to the gods? As you leave the quiet atrium of a Roman home and watch the last traces of incense rise into the night air, you are left to wonder, how much of Roman spirituality was shaped not by the heavens above, but by the subtle, fragrant gardens growing quietly behind every Roman house? To understand how deeply herbs shaped Roman daily life and subtle states of mind, you must now follow these plants into the final chapter of their journey, one that unfolds not in gardens or bathhouses, but in the quiet transition between tradition and forgetting. Because just as Rome itself slowly changed, so too did its botanical knowledge. What began as deeply rooted, household-based wisdom gradually drifted into new forms as the empire aged, declined, and eventually dissolved into the patchwork of medieval Europe. But before exploring that slow unraveling, you first need to examine the culmination of Roman herb culture, how these plants interacted with ritual, medicine, and meaning at the height of Rome's power. It was a period when Roman physicians like Galen and Dioscorides documented hundreds of plants, when trade networks brought new scents and substances from the edges of the known world, and when incense became almost synonymous with Roman identity, its aroma drifting across temples, homes, and battlefields. To begin, imagine again a Roman home, but this time focus on the lararium, the household shrine. These shrines were small, just a niche in a wall or a tiny altar near the kitchen. Yet they were the spiritual heart of the home, a place where families greeted their guardian spirits each morning. And essential to every ritual at the lararium was incense. Romans believed that burning incense invited the presence of benevolent spirits and ensured the protection of the home. But incense was more than a symbolic offering. It was an anchor of Roman sensory experience. The smell of frankincense or myrrh drifting through the atrium was a sign of normalcy, of continuity, of the household functioning as it should. The repeated exposure to these scents, morning after morning, year after year, would have had cumulative effects. They softened the mind, created familiarity, and reinforced the emotional weight of ritual. For Romans, scent became memory, and memory became belief. This link between spirituality and scent was not accidental. Marble temples across Rome were designed with this in mind. Their high ceilings and smooth surfaces reflected sound and held scent, creating an echoing, aromatic space that amplified even small amounts of incense. For a Roman standing in a temple of Jupiter, breathing the warm, resinous smoke, the sensation of the divine was not merely conceptual, it was physical. The scent filled the lungs. The quiet filled the mind. The moment felt larger than life. This phenomenon occurred at the opposite end of society as well. Soldiers on campaign burned herbs for protection. Farmers burned offerings before planting. Midwives burned herbs during childbirth for luck and health. In each case, the smoke created a sensory barrier between the ordinary world and the ritual moment. This softening of perception reinforced the belief that something important, something sacred, was taking place. But Romans were not unaware of the effects. Their writings show careful observation. The agricultural writer Columella noted that certain incenses ease the mind and settle the heart. Pliny the Elder described dozens of herbs that quiet the limbs or lift the spirits. Galen wrote of herbs that temper the nerves or clear the senses. Their vocabulary was different from ours, but their awareness was real. This connection between herb and emotion becomes even clearer when you examine the role of Roman physicians. The most famous among them, Galen, practiced in the 2nd century CE and treated everyone from gladiators to emperors. His writings shaped medical practice for over a millennium. Galen believed that herbs worked because of their inherent qualities, their heat, coldness, dryness, or moisture. While he lacked modern scientific explanations, he accurately noted the effects of dozens of herbs now recognized for their medicinal or calming properties. For example, Galen prescribed melissa or lemon balm for anxiety. He recommended chamomile for restlessness. He used mint for headaches, poppy syrup for pain, and rosemary to invigorate the senses. These remedies mirrored everyday practices, but with a more systematic approach. When Romans inhaled herbal smoke or drank herbal infusions, they were not engaging in mystical acts. They were performing the only science available to them. And yet, though scientific writing existed, it was not the primary way ordinary Romans learned about herbs. Most families relied on generational knowledge. A grandmother knew which herbs to burn during storms. A father knew how to crush bay leaves for poultices. A neighbor might share a recipe for a calming infusion made from sage and honey. Another factor was the changing religious climate. As Christianity spread through the empire, it slowly replaced older rituals. Many early Christian leaders viewed incense with suspicion because of its association with pagan practices. While incense never fully disappeared, it became part of Christian worship centuries later. Its role in domestic life diminished. The lararium rituals faded. Household incense burning declined. And with them faded the quiet, daily experiences that subtly altered the Roman mind for generations. Even Roman medicine began to change. As the empire fragmented, the systematic teachings of Galen and Dioscorides were preserved only in certain monasteries and scholarly centers. Much of the herbal knowledge once held by ordinary citizens was lost. Gardens shrank, markets changed, and trade routes collapsed. The fragrant, plant-filled world that had shaped Roman consciousness slowly dissolved. By the early medieval period, what had once been universal Roman knowledge was now specialized. Herb lore belonged to monks, healers, and a few isolated communities. The average household no longer grew a dozen herbs, burned weekly incense, or crushed leaves for daily remedies. They lived in a quieter world, not spiritually, but sensorially. Yet despite this slow fading, traces of Roman herb culture survived. Some persisted in language. Words like sage, mint, and rosemary still echo Roman usage. Others survived in recipes. Italian cuisine today still relies heavily on herbs familiar to the Romans. Still others persisted in ritual. The use of incense in Christian churches, for example, echoes ancient practices, even if separated by centuries of reinterpretation. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is the Roman idea that herb, ritual, and mind are connected. Modern aromatherapy, herbalism, and botanical medicine draw indirectly from traditions that Romans practiced instinctively. When a modern person lights lavender to sleep, they participate, unknowingly, in a continuous thread stretching back to ancient atriums where lavender burned for protection. When someone drinks chamomile for calm, they echo choices made by Roman grandmothers. And when incense fills a room in meditation or ceremony, the moment resonates with Roman temples where scented smoke rose toward marble ceilings. This continuity raises an intriguing question. Did the Romans understand something fundamental about human perception, something we still recognize, even if we explain it differently? They lacked neuroscience, chemistry, and pharmacology, but they understood the body in ways that modern science is beginning to rediscover. That scent influences emotion, that routine shapes the mind, and that the environment quietly sculpts the inner experience. Returning now to the Roman garden, small, unassuming, fragrant, you can imagine it as more than a place of cultivation. It was a classroom, a pharmacy, a sanctuary, and a sensory world contained within a few paces of soil. A place where generations learned to read plants like text, to feel their effects, and to trust the guidance of nature. But one question remains, a question that echoes across centuries. What subtle wisdom did the Romans lose when the quiet smoke of their gardens faded? And how might our understanding of ancient life change if we could step back into that herbal world for just one? As the Roman Empire declined, its herbal world did not collapse in a sudden moment. It did not disappear in fire or invasion. It faded the way a scent fades in a room after the embers of incense have cooled, slowly, quietly, and almost imperceptibly. To understand how Rome's botanical heritage dissolved, you must picture not the grand events of history, but the subtle, cumulative changes that unfolded through daily life. Imagine, for a moment, the final century of the Western Empire. Life continued normally in many ways. People still tended gardens, still bought herbs, still practiced small rituals. But the structure supporting that world, the trade networks, the educational systems, the stability of daily routines, had begun to crumble. The empire was no longer a single continuous organism. It was a collection of regions with thinning connections. This loosening of the Roman world changed everything. 1. The quiet disruptions of daily life. The first disruptions were minor. Trade ships arriving less frequently, markets offering fewer imported spices, herbalists unable to replenish their stores of exotic resins. A household accustomed to burning frankincense for morning offerings might find that the price had doubled. After a time, even wealthy families replaced frankincense with cheaper, more accessible herbs like rosemary or sage. The shift was small but meaningful. People adapted because they had to, and as they adapted, the sensory environment of Rome altered little by little. The incense that once drifted through temples and atriums became rarer. Gardens remained, but their diversity shrank. Instead of 30 herbs, a household might maintain 10. Instead of imported oils, families relied more heavily on local flora. This reduction was not catastrophic, it was gradual. But each small loss removed a thread from the tapestry of Roman herbal knowledge. 2. The shrinking of Roman space. As cities became harder to maintain, parts of them were abandoned. Public bathhouses closed because they required time, labor, and an infrastructure no longer available. The bathhouses had been some of the most important centers of herbal experience. Eucalyptus-like leaves, calming oils, scented steam. These sensations dissolved with the closure of the thermae. Without the baths, Romans lost not only a public service, but a shared sensory ritual. The city grew quieter. The scent of warmed oil no longer rose from bathhouse furnaces. Incense did not drift through communal spaces. What remained were simple, domestic expressions: a small garden in a courtyard, a pot of mint on a windowsill, a few spices carefully rationed in the kitchen. The richness of the herbal world contracted into smaller spaces. 3. The quiet transformation of religion. Religion was perhaps the most potent source of scent in Roman life. Temples burned incense daily. Rituals involved aromatic herbs, oils, and offerings. But as Christianity spread, the old temples lost their influence. Many were closed. Some were repurposed. Others stood empty, their incense burners cold. Early Christians were cautious about incense. They associated it with pagan rituals and avoided its use in domestic worship. Instead, they focused on prayer, silence, and scripture. Though incense would later become part of Christian liturgy, its domestic role diminished dramatically. A Roman child born in the 4th century might grow up with far fewer aromatic rituals than his ancestors. And with fewer rituals came fewer scents. With fewer scents came fewer sensory anchors. With fewer anchors came the erosion of memory. 4. The slow fragmentation of knowledge. But the greatest loss came not from economics or religion, but from memory itself. As the empire fragmented, the people who had once shared knowledge across vast distances found themselves isolated. A herbal recipe known in Syria might never reach Britain. A technique for drying herbs in Gaul might disappear before reaching Italy. Even the writings of Galen and Dioscorides, so foundational to Roman medicine, were copied only sporadically. Books were expensive. Scribes were few. Education became a privilege, not an expectation. Herbal knowledge, once passed through households in a constant cycle, now faced interruptions. A grandmother might die before teaching her remedies. A father might abandon gardening during times of scarcity. A herbalist might close his shop without an apprentice to carry on the tradition. Knowledge slipped away not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet neglect. 5. The gardens themselves changed. Consider again the Roman gardens, those modest plots behind homes where quiet cultivation once shaped the rhythm of life. As circumstances changed, gardens adapted. Some were uprooted to make room for other necessities. Others persisted, but with reduced variety. Seeds that had once been preserved through generations were lost. The delicate herbs that required careful tending disappeared first, replaced by hardy, practical plants. Lavender was replaced by cabbage, chamomile by barley, delicate poppy varieties by simpler cereal crops. A garden designed for healing, scent, and calm became one designed for survival. And with that transition, the sensory experience of the Roman household changed irreversibly. 6. What survived and what didn't. Despite these losses, not everything vanished. Some herbs survived due to their necessity. Mint, sage, thyme, garlic, and rosemary remained common. They were hardy, versatile, and useful in cooking. Others persisted because monasteries, with their controlled gardens, preserved them for medicinal purposes. Still, much was lost. The combinations of herbs once burned for specific moods. The small family rituals involving scent. The sensory grammar that shaped Roman perceptions of spirituality. The intimate understanding of plant temperament. The subtle connection between herbs and emotional regulation. These did not survive because they had never been written down. They had lived in gestures and habits, in the rhythm of daily chores. When the rhythm changed, the knowledge dissolved. 7. The world without Roman scents. By the early Middle Ages, people across former Roman territories lived in sensory environments very different from their ancestors. Their homes were smoky not with incense, but with wood fires. Their gardens were more practical and less diverse. Their rituals were quieter and less aromatic. The soothing scents that once drifted through bathhouses, atriums, temples, and kitchens were memories, faint echoes of a world now gone. If you were to step into a Roman home in the year 500 CE, you might still find a pot of herbs boiling on the hearth. You might see rosemary hanging to dry. But the old sensory world, the world of fragrant oils, incense burners, herbal steams, and garden rituals, would feel distant, like something half remembered. A culture once defined by scent had become a culture defined by necessity. 8. The unexpected survival of Roman herb culture. And yet, despite the long silence, Rome's herbal world did not disappear entirely. Its influence survived in places you might not expect. It survived in the monasteries of Ireland and Italy, where monks copied the works of Dioscorides. It survived in the kitchens of southern Europe, where rosemary and oregano remained beloved. It survived in the perfumed oils of the Mediterranean, whose recipes bore faint traces of Roman techniques. It survived in Christian rituals, ironically reintroducing incense centuries after rejecting it. It survived in the gardens of scholars during the Renaissance. It survived in the collective memory of ordinary people transformed but still present. Most importantly, it survived in the idea that plants influence the mind, that scent can soothe the heart, that herbs can calm the breath, that the natural world shapes human perception. This idea, passed quietly from Rome to the medieval world, eventually traveled into modern herbalism, aromatherapy, and even neuroscience. The Romans did not know the term altered states. They did not speak of neurotransmitters or volatile compounds. They did not describe the mind as chemistry, but they lived in a world shaped by aromatic chemistry every day. And without realizing it, they left behind a sensory legacy that still influences how people understand calm, focus, ritual, and healing. 9. The final echo of the Roman herbal world. As you reflect on the quiet disappearance of Roman herb culture, of incense, oils, gardens, and rituals, you might imagine the last Roman households that still practiced the old ways. Families who burned rosemary not just for cooking, but for comfort. Grandparents who still steeped herbs according to their elders' traditions. Children who still learned to tend gardens, though fewer and simpler than before. These were the last echoes of a culture that had once transformed the empire into a living landscape of scent. Imagine one such home. The garden is small but tended. The incense is local, not imported. The rituals are simple. The scents are familiar. A Roman woman lights a bundle of herbs at dusk. The smoke rises slowly. Her family sits quietly, not because the ritual demands it, but because the scent invites calm. The moment lingers. The air grows still. This small act, repeated quietly across generations, is how Rome's herbal world survived long enough to reach us. 10. A final question across time. And so, as the last traces of Roman gardens drift into the night of history, you are left with one final, lingering question. What might our understanding of ancient Rome, and of ourselves, look like if we could inhale the same scents the Romans breathed every day? Would we feel closer to them? Would their world feel less distant? Would we understand their beliefs, their rituals, and their emotions more clearly? What truths lie hidden in the fragrances that have faded? And what stories might they still tell, if only we could smell them again? If you want to understand the ancient Egyptians, not the pharaohs, not the pyramids, not the battles, then you must turn your eyes away from the monuments and look instead to something far more ordinary: the water level of the Nile River. For more than 3,000 years, Egyptian life revolved around the slow, predictable rise and fall of this river. It was the quiet metronome of their civilization, the gentle pulse that determined whether a year would be prosperous, difficult, or catastrophic. But the Egyptians did not merely live beside the Nile. They measured it. They watched it. They studied it. And over the centuries, they created one of the most detailed systems for tracking natural cycles ever developed in the ancient world. It was not astronomy that first shaped Egyptian conceptions of time. It was not mathematics, nor kingship, nor architecture. It was water. To understand this, imagine the Nile as it appeared to an Egyptian living in the Middle Kingdom around 1900 BCE. The river was wide, warm, and smooth, its surface reflecting the sky like a pane of dark blue glass. Along its edges stretched a narrow ribbon of green: villages, date palms, barley fields, and irrigation canals carefully carved by hand. Beyond this strip of life lay miles of desert, silent and pale, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The contrast between river and desert was so stark, so absolute, that Egyptians saw the Nile as the dividing line between order and chaos, between life and death. Yet the river did not behave the same way all year. For much of the year, it was calm and low. Then, at the end of summer, usually beginning in July, the river began to rise. Slowly at first, then steadily, then dramatically. The water swelled until it overflowed its banks, flooding the surrounding fields. When the floods were good, they brought fertile silt that enriched the land. When they were too high, they swept away villages and livestock. When they were too low, they left the fields barren. And so the Egyptians watched. For thousands of years, they watched. The first counters of the flood. The earliest Egyptians did not record the floods with numbers. Instead, they observed them with experience, by the height of the water against a particular rock, or the distance it traveled into a field, or the behavior of the fish and birds that swarmed the edges of the rising floodwaters. Imagine a small riverside village in 3000 BCE. The people gather by the shore as the water rises. They discuss what they see. Higher than last year. Not as high as the flood during my father's time. Enough to fill the lower fields, but not the upper ones. These observations were imprecise, but they were practical. They taught villagers how to prepare for planting and how much grain they might harvest in the coming year. Over time, these observations became part of the village's memory, stories told by elders, lessons passed down through generations. The river's behavior became a kind of communal wisdom, the invention of the Nilometer. But as Egyptian society grew increasingly complex, particularly after the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BC, the need for more precise measurements became clear. With the rise of pharaonic government came increased taxation, state planning, and large-scale irrigation projects. These required accurate predictions of grain yields, which depended entirely on the Nile flood. So the Egyptians created one of their quietest but most significant inventions, the Nilometer. A Nilometer was a simple structure, often nothing more than a staircase descending into the river or a stone column carved with measurement marks. Yet it was revolutionary. With it, Egyptians could track the flood not by vague comparisons to previous years, but by specific, documented levels. The most famous Nilometers were built at places like Elephantine Island, Philae, and the Temple of Kamombo. But many smaller communities had their own local versions, some little more than carved lines on the side of a riverbank. Imagine a priest descending the slippery stone steps of a Nilometer at dawn. He holds a simple measuring rod. The water laps at the bottom step. Each day he records how high the river has climbed. 11 cubits, 12 cubits, 13 and a half, 14. The numbers are not merely data. They are forecasts of life. At 14 cubits, the flood will be ideal. At 16, dangerous. At 10, disastrous. These measurements became the foundation of Egyptian economics. They determined taxes, predicted food supply, and offered early warnings of famine. The river as a calendar. But the Egyptians did not only use the Nile to measure water, they used it to measure time. Before Egypt developed solar and lunar calendars, it followed the rhythm of the flood, which had 3 main seasons. Ake, the flooding, July to November. Parate, the growing, December to March. Shimu, the harvesting, April to June. These were not symbolic divisions. They were practical, meaningful categories based on the river's behavior. Life shifted around them. Work, rituals, taxes, building projects, and festivals all followed this slow pattern. During Ake, fields were underwater, so peasants worked on state projects, like temple construction or canal maintenance. During Parate, they planted. During Shimu, they harvested. The river's rhythm structured everything. And yet the Egyptians did not think of this as following nature. To them, the river was nature. It was a god, Hapi, who brought life to the land. Its flooding was not just a hydrological event, it was a sacred act, ritual, and observation. Egyptian priests were the primary keepers of flood knowledge. Each morning, they climbed the Nilometers, observed the river, and wrote the results on papyrus scrolls. These scrolls were archived in temple libraries, forming a long-running record of floods stretching centuries into the past. One of the earliest surviving flood records comes from the Palermo stone, which notes Nile levels in the reigns of kings who lived 4,500 years ago. These records reveal that Egyptians had been tracking water levels long before most civilizations developed writing. But while the priests treated the flood as a divine phenomenon, they also used the measurements pragmatically. A flood too low meant the gods were displeased or that scarcity was imminent. A flood too high meant danger, requiring warnings to nearby villages. The priest's dual role, both religious and administrative, created a system where spirituality and environmental science blended seamlessly. Imagine a priest standing on the steps of a Nilometer during a rising flood. The air is warm, thick with humidity. Frogs croak at the water's edge. The priest feels the smooth stone beneath his feet and watches the water surge another half cubit compared to yesterday. He records the number, but he also interprets it. He considers how the gods might be communicating through the water's height. To him, the measurement is both data and message. The ordinary Egyptian perspective. While priests kept official records, ordinary Egyptians engaged with the flood in a different way. A farmer waking at dawn might step onto the edge of his field and watch as the waters creep closer each day. He reads the signs he has learned from his father and grandfather. The color of the water, the smell of the mud, the timing of certain bird migrations, the behavior of the catfish that swarmed during the early flood. He does not need a Nilometer to understand what the year will bring. His senses are his instruments. His memory is his archive. Imagine the farmer squatting at the water's edge, scooping up a handful of silt. He rubs it between his fingers, testing its consistency. He knows the river intimately, its moods, its sounds, its changes. To him, the Nile is not a data source. It is a companion, a teacher, a presence that shapes his entire life. Flood stories and collective memory. Over generations, Egyptians developed a rich body of storytelling around the flood. Some tales were cautionary, recalling years when the waters failed to rise. Others were celebratory, praising years of abundant harvests. These stories became part of the collective memory, reinforcing the idea that the flood cycle was not just natural but moral, that human behavior, divine favor, and environmental rhythms were all intertwined. One such tale describes a year when the flood rose too high, sweeping away half of a village's homes. Another recounts a drought that forced families to forage for edible plants in the desert, an unimaginable hardship in a land so dependent on the river's generosity. These stories served as reminders, warnings, and lessons. They shaped the Egyptians' understanding of time, nature, and destiny. The role of scribes. As Egyptian society grew more complex, scribes became the keepers of knowledge, recording flood levels in long-running chronicles. These chronicles allowed Egyptian officials to compare current floods to those of previous generations. A scribe in the New Kingdom, for example, might consult records from 300 years earlier to determine how an unusually low flood should be interpreted. These comparisons were crucial because climate patterns shifted over centuries, and past data helped predict future outcomes. Imagine a scribe seated in a cool room lined with scrolls. He dips his reed pen into ink made from soot and water. He writes carefully, recording the flood level for the year. He consults an older scroll, comparing the numbers. In doing so, he becomes part of a chain stretching back centuries, a quiet lineage of observation. 1,000 years of watching water rise. As centuries passed, Egyptian flood measurements became some of the most consistent environmental records in human history. They allow modern researchers to reconstruct Nile patterns across millennia. They reveal periods of stability, periods of drought, and periods of excessive flooding. And yet, through all these changes, one constant remained. The Egyptians watched. They measured. They adjusted their lives to the river's slow rhythms. This is the heart of the story. A civilization built not on conquest or innovation, but on patient observation of a single natural cycle. Every year, without fail, Egyptians waited for the waters to rise. Every year, they measured. Every year, they adapted.